Good morning, Andrew.
Morning, Matt. Good to see you.
You as well. I'm sitting in John's chair. There's John.
Hi,
Okay,
sorry about that. I had
wonderful. No
orders
problem.
from my boss, my wife, not to come out inside.
You feeling okay? John?
Huh?
John, are you doing okay?
Yeah, I'm doing okay.
Okay.
Just a quickie, he said, don't go too cold, John. You don't go outside.
Okay.
Right.
There's everybody.
All right. Well,
Hi,
good to see
Andrew.
you all this morning.
Hey, Andrew, I've got that video queued up so we can share it when you're ready.
Okay. And I can share, I'm sending you a request right now to share my screen.
Oh, yeah.
Hopefully multiple printers can share. Okay. I think that
Give me some.
if I click it, yeah. Okay. Beautiful. Okay. Let's go ahead and pull this up. Let's see.
Great.
Is that working for you all? Can you see
Yep.
that?
Looks good.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, wonderful. Welcome. It's good to be with you all here today. As you can see, the topic I want to discuss this morning is kind of about how do we deal with difficult biblical text and what does that mean for kind of protecting sacred landscapes? Obviously, the personal passion I have for this topic comes from an overwhelming love, not only of God, but also of God's creation, as well as being a father of a 4-year-old who, I very much want to see thrive and succeed in this world. I suspect many of you all who have children and grandchildren, want to make sure that the earth is taken care of and we are responsible stewards for them and for future generations. And so that's a lot of my passion as well. And I obviously believe that if we don't start to address some of the challenges and realities that are going on, it will be much harder for those generations to survive and to thrive. So, after leading a trip of 40 different faith leaders to Bears Ears, as you all heard last week, obviously formed Earth Keepers 360, which is kind of a nationwide movement of equipping spiritual leaders and faith communities with the tools that they need to kind of effectively engage on modern environmental issues. As you can see, we kind of work on a wide variety of different issues, from everything from public lands and wildlife to water to climate energy to resilience, justice, and outdoor equity. And really, over the past year, just alone, I've worked with a chaplain in Georgia to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, a Presbyterian congregation in Florida to save sensitive coastline areas, the San Carlos Apache over in Arizona to work on protecting an area that's very sacred to them called Oak Flat, and then obviously worked with a lot of our tribal leaders and Hispanic leaders in New Mexico to protect places like everything from Chaco Canyon to the Caja del Rio, which we'll be talking about much more today. And one of the things, of course, I enjoy most, and folks know this, is working on, kind of this idea of how do we interpret different biblical text and what does that look like? And how do we wrestle with everything from those pesky dominion text in the book of Genesis to everything from Revelation and what it means to have a new world, so to speak, and how do we kind of deal with those from environmental perspectives? So obviously want to encourage you all, as Jen probably mentioned last week, to kind of sign up for our weekly reflection and our newsletter. Certainly can send John and the rest of you all the link for that, but that's a lot of where you get to see what we're kind of doing on the ground and what we're doing at an advocacy level, as well as what we're doing kind of from that kind of spiritual educational level and how do we help equip and support congregations.
Could you, before you get too much further, talk about those pesky dominion scriptures?
Yeah, we're going to do a whole thing on that. You got it. So that's actually going to be the core of a big chunk of today's presentation. So I'm glad you're asking that. And before we kind of jump right into that, which is where we're going next, here you can see a picture of Aldo Leopold. And Aldo Leopold was the founder of the National Wildlife, one of the founders of the National Wildlife Federation, but definitely the founder of the New Mexico Wildlife Federation. And some of you are maybe familiar with Leopold. I would just guess by show of hands. Do you all know who Aldo Leopold is? All right, good. He's was an author, a scientist, a forester, a conservationist, and he worked for the U.S. Forest Service before he became a professor at the University of Wisconsin. He wrote a famous book called the Sand County Almanac, which kind of developed a new conservation ethic called the land ethic. And most significantly, here in New Mexico, Leopold was the head ranger for the Carson National Forest. and he moved to Tres Piedras, where you can see his cabin is still remaining, and you can go visit his cabin in Tres Piedras, which is right there on the New Mexico-Colorado border. Would somebody mind reading this quote from Aldo Leopold?
He also lived in Albuquerque for 2 years.
That's right, and he was down in the Gila, so exactly right. So, someone mind reading this Leopold quote?
You gonna read it for us, Lane?
What?
That's who will read the quote? I'm reading something later for
I
Andrew.
can't see it.
No important change in human conduct is ever accomplished without an internal change in our intellectual emphases, our loyalties, our affections, and our convictions. The proof that conservation has not yet touched these foundations of conduct lies in the fact that philosophy, ethics, and religion have not yet heard of it.
So speaking to Leopold's point, I'm a firm believer that faith communities and churches are going to be critical, not only in raising education and awareness about different conservation issues, but also getting at those deeper held values and convictions that will enable us to make the hard but necessary decisions that are to come. I think who better to talk about ethics, discernment, decision making, and sacrifice really than the church. And I think Leopold knew this, and towards the end of his career, as a scientist, he would actually was engaged in kind of a letter writing campaign between him and one of the other professors in the religion department, because he realized that, we're going to need all of these different entities and perspectives to really work on some of these different conservation issues that he was facing back in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. So, Leopold was obviously well ahead of his curve. So over this next decade, we're going to be faced with an enormous amount of environmental challenges. For example, here on the bottom corner of the screen, you can see the NASA satellite photo showing the massive methane cloud hanging over the Four Corners area in the Navajo Nation. This cloud is now twice the size of the state of Delaware, and is caused by the burning, obviously, of coal, as well as increased fracking and oil and gas production in the area of the Four Corners. This energy production is not only having an impact on the area, but also, also certainly on the area's wildlife and water. So a good example of that is when I worked with Senator Heinrich, and this is back in 2014, 2015. One of the big issues that occurred was, many of you may know, I'm also a fly fisherman. San Juan is one of the nation's best quality waters for fishing, really world famous. There was an issue where there was a huge rainstorm, and down Simone Canyon came all this erosion and sand basically filling up, 2 of the 4 miles of quality waters blocked off with this huge sandbar, and none of the fish could pass, and the river was pretty much compromised from that point. And none of the boats could get through there to guide. And there was a huge issue with basically this erosion that came down. And what they found was it was unmaintained oil and gas pads at the top of the canyon. And so there was this huge tension within the Four Corners of the 2 biggest industries, which is oil and gas clearly. And then of course, fishing and guiding on the San Juan. Were hugely impacted. And so I worked with those communities to kind of look at, what are the real, kind of these indirect impacts that we're not always aware of that can obviously have major impacts to, the rural economy in that area, the livelihood of many different kind of people, but also certainly, the sporting values and heritage of that, as well as, of course, the wildlife in the land and the water. And so there's kind of issues like that we have to start to see that interconnectivity. One of my favorite quotes, though, is the fact that, this quote from Leopold: "In our attempt to make conservation easy, we have made it trivial." And then, of course, in honor of King Weekend, nothing pains a person more than hard critical thinking, right? And this no problem can be solved by the same level of consciousness that caused it. That's one of my favorites, from Einstein, kind of picking up on this idea that we have to move to a deeper level of consciousness to deal with some of these issues. We have to think in a more dynamic and creative way. And we also have to kind of move past the current ways that we're thinking and recognize the blocks and the limitations and the boundaries of those. And I think we need to do that with regard to the biblical text that we're going to look at today, but I also think we need to do that with the challenges we're facing environmentally, whether that's at the congregational level, the state level, the regional level, and of course at the national and international level. So I really, think it's going to be important that we deal with what are the root causes of some of these issues. How do we address them? And, how is the church and faith communities situated to try to deal with some of these bigger challenges? All right. So with that said, and as per request, I'd like to call on Matt to read this chapter of Genesis. I was actually just teaching this to our middle school kids, and it was just really great to sit down with kids who have never read this story, never heard this story, and kind of delve deeper into it. And so as Matt reads this story, I'm hoping you all can kind of do that very same thing of listening with fresh ears and looking with fresh eyes on this story of creation. Go ahead, Matt.
When God began to create the heavens and the earth was complete chaos, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. And God said, "Let there be a dome in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." So God made the dome and separated the waters that were under the dome from the waters that were above the dome. And it was so. God called the dome sky, and there was evening, and there was morning, the second day. And God said, "Let the waters under the sky be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the water together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind on earth that bear fruit with the seed in it." And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed of every kind, and trees of every kind bearing fruit with the seed in it. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. And God said, "Let there be lights in the dome of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth." And it was so. God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. God set them in the dome of the sky to give light upon the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. And God said, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the dome of the sky." So God created the great sea monsters and every living creature that moves of every kind with which the waters swarm, and every winged bird of every kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them, saying, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures of every kind, cattle and creeping things, and wild animals of the earth of every kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals of the earth of every kind, and the cattle of every kind, and everything that creeps upon the ground of every kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make humans in our image, according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." So God created humans in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth." God said, "See, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree with seed in its fruit. You shall have them for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every bird of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, everything that has the breath of life, I have given every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day.
Excellent. All right. So why start with Genesis? This book obviously gets at central questions in terms of our theology and at the heart of today's presentation, but of course it's at the very beginning of time, space, matter, everything, and of course the very beginning of the Bible and where things start from the Judeo-Christian perspective. It also gets at core questions. Who is God and what is God concerned with? Who are we? How do we orient ourselves towards God, towards one another, towards creation and all that is around us? So obviously looking at these creation texts, the book of Genesis contains two accounts of creation, as you all know. The first, which is the whole first chapter of Genesis, God brings order out of the chaos. The Spirit hovers over the chaos as God creates the heavens and the earth, ordering of the entire cosmos. God creates the world and in 6 days and rest on the seventh. The first 3 days of creation, God marks out 3 earthly realms, day and night, sky and sea, land and plants. On the second 3 days, God populates these realms with stars and planets, birds and fish, land and animals. When God speaks, all things come into being. And God is the creator of all things from land to life. And God is pleased, acknowledging the goodness of this creation. Genesis 2 contains the second creation account, which is less focused on the creation of the greater cosmos and more on the creation of the Garden of Eden and the role that humanity will play regarding the cosmos. So we're going to look at these kind of side by side. At the very end of Genesis, at the end of the 6th day, God creates humanity in God's own image. Obviously, there's a whole lot that we can talk about in a whole other presentation on the importance of this text and what it means to see the face of God and the image of God in all of God's children. But today I want to focus specifically on the latter half of this verse that I believe has been horribly misconstrued and used to justify unlimited power over creation and license to exploit creation. So there's a lot, obviously, of folks in the environmental movement that want to blame the ecological crisis and some of the bigger problems we're facing on things like the church. But I think in Genesis 1:26, we see that God gives dominion. Right? But as you'll notice there from what you see on the slide, the word for dominion is the word radah. It's the Hebrew word radah. And it gives dominion over the animals. And the first thing that I think we have to notice is that when this power is given to humanity, that we are in a place of pre-sin Eden, right? This power is given to humanity that knows no evil, but only, of course, knows innocence and good. Second, the Hebrew word for dominion is radah, as I said. Radah, which carries with it the meaning to rule, not in the sense of exploitation, but in the sense of a shepherd ruling over his sheep. That's the same word that you get picked up throughout the Hebrew Bible is the same word that we translate as dominion here, is that same word as the shepherd ruling over the sheep. The Hebrew carries with it a sense of caregiving and even nurturing. While there is definitely a sense of power and authority that comes with the word radah, it is one of royal responsibility and balance of power. In terms of royal responsibility, radah is the same word used later in the Hebrew Bible to discuss kings ruling over their subjects. In terms of balance of power, radah is literally the word that's used just a few verses earlier to describe the delicate balance in Genesis 1:16, that God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule, or radah, the day, and the lesser light to rule, or radah, the night and the stars. Isn't it interesting that when it comes to the ruling of the sun over the day and the moon over the night, we use the word and we translate the same exact word as to rule, but when it comes to humanity, we translate the word as dominion? So, this balance of power is not just about humanity's relationship to the animals or to creation, but really about God's own grace. and God's own grace and willingness to balance God's power by sharing responsibility for creation with God, right? This, basically, as we all know as Presbyterians, not only is God omniscient, omnipresent, but also all powerful, right? We recognize the sovereignty of God. So God limits God's self by giving authority and power to humanity in doing this. It's a sense of grace and responsibility. It's a sense of a shepherd ruling over the sheep, a sense of nurturing and caregiving, right? God is willing to limit God's self by sharing this balance of power with humanity. And again, it's about that sense of royal responsibility. So you'll see in Genesis 1:28 that the Hebrew word for subdue is kabosh, right? Many of you have probably heard the word kabosh, right? That is the Hebrew word that the English is translating as subdue. The focus is on cultivating the earth, which obviously is an especially difficult task. Was it a really difficult task at the time these texts were written? Obviously, they did not have the technology and the tractors and the farming and the chainsaws and things that we had nowadays. While the verb may involve some coercive aspects in later passages of the Hebrew Bible in terms of dealing with hostels, right? Put the kibosh on them. This is not the case here because, of course, there's no enemies, right? Everything, again, has been created as good. Rather, God gives power and tasks humanity with bringing order to the earth, for paradise is not static. Humanity is to work alongside God in this creative process, work alongside the Spirit, right, that hovers over creation to bring about order. And of course, as Timothy reminds us, and is, very true to the Presbyterian faith, we obviously use Scripture to interpret Scripture and kind of give us further clarity. So you can kind of see in Genesis 2 what is really interesting. So in Genesis 2, I think it's really important to notice that the command of dominion, the word that we translate for dominion, which is radah, which is also, I would say, is equally and importantly is translated as to rule responsibly, is directly followed by the Sabbath. That is, that order and creation require rest and reflection. That neither God nor creation is in full development mode, full efficiency mode, but that the land and all that is on it shall be given rest. And the command to subdue the earth is fleshed out by Genesis 2:15. And this is where I think things get really interesting. Here, the Hebrew is very important and very interesting, and a lot of us probably never even thought about this or looked at it. But the word that the NRSV Bible translation translates is to till the earth, right? That you see the Lord God took the human and put the human in the Garden of Eden to till it and to keep it. So the word to till it, that the Hebrew word is abad. So you can see it right there, and I put the Hebrew, and that's the word abad, which literally means to serve. We are called to serve the land as a servant would serve a master. So that same word abad is used when it's talking about servants serving a master in Genesis 12:6. Where the people of Israel serve God, Exodus 4:23 uses the same word abad, and there we translated it as to serve the earth, or to serve. So the same word, ironically, in the Hebrew Bible that we're using in other places to mean to serve, we translate as to till here. So, what would be different about our world? How would we consider things? How would our relationship be different to the earth if instead of translating this same word as to till the earth, we translated it as to serve the earth? And what would that mean for our theology? The human being is to be in service to the earth, upon which our life and our livelihood depend. Humans are not thus placed in a role of dominance, but dependence and stewardship of the earth. The Hebrew word translated as to keep the earth is the word samar. And from the beginning, God entrusts us to be keepers of God's creation, or earth keepers, and to share God's work of creation. So that is exactly where we have the name of where we came from, earth keepers, is that word that you're seeing right there, samar, is to keep the earth. And what is the responsibility of being an earth keeper? And so summing up this passage for Christians and for Christianity, many of you probably have read the Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann. I'm sure Matt knows Brueggemann. Brueggemann notes that a Christian understanding of dominion thus must be discerned in the way of Jesus of Nazareth, who taught us that the one who rules is the one who serves. The greatest among us must be our servant, and the task of ruling must follow the great shepherd, who is not in control, but who lays down his life for his sheep, says Brueggemann. Aligned with the life of Christ, humanity is put over and given power over creation, not to lord it over creation, but to serve creation with humility and to join God in the creative behavior of enhancing it. So obviously, as we impose ashes and we're coming up upon Ash Wednesday and Lent, we regularly say that the sacred words, and I'm sure, Matt, if you all do your Ash Wednesday service, will say, from dust you have arisen, to dust you shall return. However, rarely do we recognize the spiritual significance of the beginning words rooted in Genesis. From dust you have arisen, right? We tend to focus on Ash Wednesday, the dust you shall return. But when we are saying things like from dust you have arisen, what we are being reminded of is that we are one with creation and one with the Creator. When we say from dust you have arisen, we are being challenged to no longer see creation as something outside of us, but as something deeply within us and core to who we are. When we say words like from dust you have arisen, we are reminded that we all hold the sacred calling to care for and to be good stewards and keepers of God's creation. So it's not just tribal wisdom or ancient faith traditions that lift up all these important truths. I mean, folks like Carl Sagan, who's a renowned scientist, concluded in studying the cosmos and the universe, he said this: the cosmos is within us. We are all made of stardust. We are a way for the universe to know itself. I thought that was a really profound quote. A way for the universe to know itself is through humanity. So, and we'll have a little bit of time for discussion here, but obviously these themes get picked up in the Psalms, right? The Psalms are filled with all kinds of images of creation. Psalm 8 picks up on this theme of royal responsibility, for God has shaped created order in such a way that the Creator and the creatures share overlapping spheres of interdependence and creative responsibility together. We are to serve God by ruling responsibly over God's creation, but our rule and power is never independent of God, and it is always in, of course, submission to the Creator. As Psalm 24 reminds us, the earth is the Lord's and all that it is in it. The earth is not ours, right? The earth is the Lord's. We hold the earth in a sacred trust, and we are called to be responsible stewards of this creation. It is not our planet, it is God's planet. We are merely tenants on the Creator's planet. As Psalm 65 reminds us, when we look at the beauty of creation, we also understand the beauty of the Creator and the interconnectedness of creation. And obviously, when we kind of focus on moving towards this idea of Ash Wednesday, Lent, Easter, this idea of, we have to ask, what does it mean to practice the resurrection? And I'm guessing probably similar to that question, the disciples asked themselves the very same thing. And here you see an interesting response from Jesus, which are some of the last words that Jesus offers in the Gospel of Mark. Go into all the world and proclaim the good news to the whole creation, is the way it's said, right? St. Francis obviously picks up on that idea of proclaiming the gospel, not just to humanity, but all of creation, including the animals and the wildlife and the trees. And the good news needs to be heard through all of it and understood and living consistently with it. And so this idea of sacredness and stewardship of creation is an important part of, obviously, our Reformed theology. A lot of folks read John Calvin. You all probably have heard of Calvin, obviously one of the key founders of the Presbyterian tradition. And Calvin tends to be interpreted very much as a legalist. A lot of people will read his Institutes from a very legal kind of perspective. But Calvin was also very much a mystic. He was obviously a very deep spiritual leader, pastor. And he says things like creation is the theater of God's glory. Right? That, you look at creation and you can see the beauty and the complexity of the Creator and start to get a sense of who God is. And obviously creation does not capture the fullness of that, but it does speak to kind of the amazingness of the artist behind the creation. And Calvin obviously picked up on that years ago. So with that said, I want to just take a second here. If you have any questions on kind of some of that biblical basis, if that kind of got at a little bit about why I was saying some of those texts are pesky, I do think there needs to be much more thoughtful analysis and preaching around these kind of texts and looking at those kind of original root words of how the Hebrew kind of lays out those texts. But open for a second for questions, and then I kind of want to move on to what does that mean for America's public lands, and what does that mean here in New Mexico, and obviously for kind of the bigger reality of what's going to be happening here. Any questions or thoughts?
Wayne.
One of the things that Matthew read was in our image. God said, I'm going to create you in our image. Who was he referring to when he said our?
It's a good question. Matthew, you're going to get ready to preach on a test like that? There's some people that will say, you know, we want to box God in a very binary, gender binary kind of way that'll say, you know, male, female, made in that image, right? And so that plural is kind of catching up in the pronoun usage of our society today. There's some folks that would say that. There's some folks that are saying, you know, there's this kind of angelic court, right, that is surrounding God at that moment, and you get some of that picked up in the Book of Revelation. And so I think that that's a great question. I mean, that's a lot of, I'm sure there's a lot of midrash and Talmud, you know, Talmudic tradition around that exact passage. I know there is for a fact, around what does that mean to be created in our image. You know, I think that there's a definitive sense that there's not multiple gods. This is not a ancient world of that, but there's a complex understanding of God not just being very simplified in binary human terms, or very simplified in the sense of, like, you know, occurring within a much greater angelic court or heavenly realm. And so it's a good question. It's definitely one that, you know, deserves a lot of study and fleshing out. Matt, is there anything you want to add on that?
Well, yeah, I would just say two things, kind of to piggyback. It is a feature of ancient Near Eastern religion and including Hebrew religion, the idea of what you kind of mentioned, a heavenly court. There's a lot of language in the Hebrew scripture that traffics in that kind of language. The whole premise of Job is predicated on the existence of a heavenly court, and the Satan is simply the advocate, is simply the one making an argument against God's assertion. So that's part of the cosmology of those ancient Near Eastern religions. Also, the word Elohim
It's plural.
is plural.
Yep.
Right? Which is one of the Hebrew names for God. But then the counter, just kind of to the rest of Andrew's point, you get the Deuteronomy, you get the Shema, which is, Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It is absolutely monistic. In that sense.
In the Old Testament course I took when I was at the University of Chicago Divinity School, the professor Wilcoxon suggested that each of the patriarchs brought a different God with them. And that one of the reasons there was Elohim was because they were trying to sort of move in the direction of monotheism, but they started out by being henotheistic before they got there. I
Right.
don't really want to get us off the topic that we're here for today, but I just thought I'd add.
No, I'm really glad you asked that, because one of the things we were just talking about with the middle school kids was exactly some of this, and this idea of how do we talk about something so profoundly deep and inherent to who we are and how everything began, and do that in a way that is relatively concise and passed through an oral tradition. And so, yes, it is that a lot of that tension. And of course, you know, as Matt was saying, there's a lot of scholarship and kind of thought that then expounds upon. I mean, this one chapter of Genesis, people can literally make their entire life studies on, right? And so how do we kind of deal with what does that really mean, and what is the interpretation of that, and how does that then tie into later interpretations and later scholarship and later writings, right? But those are great questions.
Right.
Presbyterians believe that God is a spirit, infinite, eternal, and unchangeable in God's being, wisdom, power, holiness, justice, goodness, and truth.
Did you learn that in the Westminster Confession of Faith?
Yes. in the
There you go.
Very
Well,
good.
So
and
there's
notice,
nothing in there about singular or plural.
Well, it is-
It's attributes.
It does lend itself to a danger, because I have heard people argue for Trinitarian theology using Hebrew scripture, which is just kind of so wrong. However, I will say, the suggestion of let us make humanity in our image. I prefer this creation story from a human origin standpoint in some ways to the second creation story, only because we are created as a people, not as individuals. And maybe it's just my reaction to the disease of American hyper-individualism. But here's a biblical text that says, no, your individual life is not the most important thing. Your individual life as it exists within a web of humanity. And to your point, to this study's point, Andrew, your individual life as it exists within the web of creation is far more important than your personal preference.
Matthew, can
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then Diane. Andrew.
Andrew,
Yep.
as you're moving on to kind of what this means for public lands.
Yep.
That strikes me in the verses that you've read is this kind of idea of living in harmony and appreciating creation and, you know, being respectful and being stewards, and this language that sounds net positive, right? And then almost as if the injection of humans, or at least the way humans have fallen from grace, is negative. We can call that sin or
Sure.
whatever. The thing I hope you touch on, or the tension that I'm having in my head that I'm listening to, is nature stays in harmony often in violent ways.
Oh, yeah.
You know, you can remove humans from this earth. It doesn't turn into a Disney movie. And so for us to live in harmony with earth, which I assume is where kind of the next part goes, that often includes a lot of violence to balance. And
Yeah. And I think,
humans have been fighting against that violence.
yeah. And I think you're
Our
getting
survival
at,
is a listener to the earth.
yeah, I think you're, so yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I think the big thing that the Christian tradition, has, you know, neglected, and certainly there's writers, you know, everyone from Thomas Berry to Matthew Fox to other folks who, you know, one of the big challenges they see in the Christian tradition is that skip over of the goodness of creation, right? The balance of harmony, and getting into the original sin over the original blessing is the way those folks would kind of title it. That kind of coming back to that. But you're right that there always was this creative tension, right? That there always, and I would say, you know, humanity wasn't good or bad. Humanity was a co-partner with God, recognizing that, you know, there wasn't just a sense of paradise, right? That it also took creation and balance and order, even in the original text of the garden, right? That there was always this sense of humanity had a role in balancing that. Obviously, that role skews greatly in the next couple chapters, and especially as we head into the Cain and Abel land. But you know, what I would say is you're exactly right. There's always been an important role for humanity to play in kind of co-bringing about that order, co-bringing about that balance, that harmony, that we are not just, you know, kind of objective of observers of creation, but that we are very much participants in it, right? And that participation can be very much living more into that balance or harmony, or kind of throwing that balance or harmony off. And so I think your point is a very good one, because this is also, I think, some of the challenge of what you see in Isaiah, what you see in Jesus, even a little bit in the book of Revelation, for sure, of like, things have gotten way out of balance, things have gotten out of harmony. How does the lion lay down next to the sheep, right? How does the wolf kind of lay down next to things that the wolf would prey upon? And I think that's that kind of sense of that vision of the kingdom of God kind of coming back in, is that restoration of harmony. And that gets obviously picked up heavily in the prophets, obviously gets picked up in Jesus, and certainly in those more apocryphal texts in Revelation, a lot more of that kind of lion, you know, sheep kind of balance, right? And so I think that's kind of the big challenge too, right? You're exactly right that things were definitely not stagnant. They were definitely not paradise, where we didn't have to do anything, but they also weren't quite out of whack and as we understand them today. And so I think that's obviously, and not even today. I mean, I'm talking 2,000 years ago, or, you know, 1,500 years ago, when you'd see some of these prophetic messages being written, and then obviously Jesus kind of picking up on some of those same themes, and well into, you know, the 200s and 300s with some of the later, you know, text. And so it is very interesting that you're kind of bringing that up, because I think it's a good point. I mean, I think that this idea that it was just all harmony and there was nothing to be done is probably an over pendulum swing in the one direction. And then on the other hand, just saying, you know, it's a kill world and survival of the fittest is probably the swing in the other direction. And I think as everything, and as you'll hear me talk from a more ecological perspective, everything is always held in tension and in balance, right? And I think that you even see that kind of tension and imbalance with the way things are created, right? The light and the dark, the land and the sea. There's always kind of this push-pull going on in creation.
Oh, yeah, you were next.
So, with that said, I just want to make sure we kind of jump to this idea of, let's talk a little bit about public lands. I think most folks, when they talk.
Andrew,
Yeah.
just, we got one more question here.
Okay, sorry, I
before we move on.
couldn't see it. Sorry. Yeah, what's up?
I was taken by the comment that the role of the leader is to serve. And that means to serve the people, to serve the land. And, I think in our modern world that that's not necessarily the prevalent concept. And it may even become much more radical in the next few days. So how do we as Christians hold this idea of that we are to serve the earth, not that the earth is really to serve us? How do we respond as we live our lives going forward with a country which may take very different viewpoints on how we manage our natural resources and how we use them, and what is the right way to do this? And what holds us back? Is it that we don't want to spend the money, or that we don't have it, or that we see profit more important than a long future for the earth? So, I feel drawn more to what's going to happen in the next few days and trying to understand the biblical references or how they mesh and how we respond.
Yes. No, those are the $1 million questions for sure. What I would say is the first thing is what we have to do is exactly what you just did, which is asking the right questions and looking back at these texts. And the reason I say these texts are very important is because, why was that word translated as to till the earth as opposed to serve the earth? What would the implications of that be? What would be the agenda behind that kind of translation, and why? And what are, some of the tensions that we need to hold and why we would translate it one way or the other? I think you're asking the exact right questions. And then what are the modern day implications of when we translate it one way versus the other, and what have been the, kind of the fruits of that, right? Of those implications. I think your point is a really good one, which is, what does this mean kind of for our society today? I think that gets at the question I was kind of pointing out to you all. If you think that you are outside of creation, that creation is not part of you, that you're an objective observer, not playing a participatory role, and you don't really have any responsibility for it, then you're going to take a very different ethical and practical approach to how you live your life. If you have a deeper set of values that say, my role is to please the Creator, and I have been given this responsibility, and I have a sacred trust, and I value deeply this very precious gift, and it is being impacted and potentially destroyed, I probably may live a very different life in how I practically carry my life out and live that sense. And maybe also why I sacrifice, right? If I think I have nothing to do with any of this, then why would I make any sacrifices or change or transformation? I do think, those bigger questions you were asking around why do we do kind of what we do, and will we continue to kind of, cause harm to creation? Those are bigger. Those are Garden of Eden questions, no doubt about it, right? And those are questions that I think we have to have exactly these conversations. My big concern that I see in working at the National Wildlife Federation, for example, is what Thoreau said: thousands are swinging at the leaves while only one is striking at the root. We can deal with clean air and the EPA or clean water and, some of these different important bedrock laws of the environmental movement. Well, what are the root causes of why people are doing what they're doing to each other and to creation, right? Is it about greed? Is it about selfishness? Is it about fear, right? And if the spiritual, religious world and theological world and the preaching of Matt isn't touching on that, then we've got a big problem, right? And who better to touch on those things? Because we can fight over environmental policies or policies on public lands and fight on that thousand swinging at the leaf level. But we got to get at what are we really talking about here? And what are the core values that are disrupting or enabling healthy community? And I think that's critical for the environmental world and critical for the theological and spiritual and religious world, critical for the church world. We have got to get at why are people doing what we're doing? And what are the bigger implications, and what are the forces kind of driving that? And if we can't do that as a church, we might as well, mail it in, because that's what I think, a lot of what obviously Jesus' ministry was about fear, greed, insecurity, selfishness, all of these different things that kind of get picked up thematically within the Christian faith and tradition. And what's driving our outward behaviors, I think, is really critical. So I would just, I think this is a bigger conversation. I love the fact that you all are asking these questions, and I obviously think they're fascinating and core to kind of who we are as a people of faith, right? Who Jesus wants us to be. As I was teaching last week, we know that we are saved as Christians, as followers of Christ, but what are we saved for, right? What does that mean in terms of how we then live that salvation out in the world? And that's kind of the $1 million question, obviously, that Matt and I as pastors kind of constantly think and ask, and challenge you on in sermons and teachings and all kinds of ways. But that's what you're getting at, right? What are we doing here, and why are we doing it, and what are the root causes of what we're doing, and who can speak to that, and who can address that, and how do we not conform our mind to the world around us and just think everything's okay, and how do we start to transform and seek the renewal of our minds, as kind of Paul would talk about. And I think all of that's
Can I ask a
fair
question?
play.
Yeah, I've always wondered why it says be fruitful and multiply. I'm of the generation of ZPG. And when you see the population growth over the last 10,000 years, it's a huge spike in 1900. And we've become an invasive species. Why does it say to be fruitful and multiply when we've got to start controlling our reproduction?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can certainly get into those texts historically and what they meant with, infant mortality, maternal mortality, why, communities needed a certain population to thrive, to work, to have as a basis. I mean, even in places like Africa, they're still wrestling very much with those challenges and realities. When I was over there and studying, I think those are really good questions. I mean, I think I want to kind of stay on topic in terms of where we can go in this presentation, but I definitely would love to keep these conversations going, because I think these are really good questions. And you're right. I think that one of the big challenges the earth faces is not just population, but I would also say the livelihood of that population, right? The impact to the creation of somebody who may be in an African village versus the everyday average American may be dramatically different, right? So it's
Yeah,
not just
we're
about the amount of
consumers.
people, but the lifestyle they're living, and we can certainly talk more about that. But with that said, Matt, is it okay? I can't quite always see the room. Is it okay to kind of move to this next?
Yeah, I think we're ready to keep rolling.
Okay, cool. So obviously public lands, people talk a lot and think about, these bigger areas like national parks and things like that. But, we have 640 million acres of public lands in the United States, 27 million acres of public lands in New Mexico alone. Obviously, used for all kinds of multiple uses, from everything from recreation, but also, of course, to industry. So you were asking about kind of this, where are things going, what may happen. I mean, we have a little bit of a clue on what may happen kind of in the next administration with regard to public lands. This is what you saw of the Trump administration one on kind of around energy dominance and kind of what was happening with that. We're still tallying the numbers and getting the final numbers for Biden, and I want to kind of maybe even next week I'll be able to do a comparison of the two. But I think this is a good indicator of potentially, your concerns and what's maybe coming, what's going to happen on public lands. Obviously, there's bigger threats, and we can certainly talk about this too next week with around the sell-off and transfer of public lands to industry. And so there's kind of those kind of things are the backdrop. But I think that's really important that you're asking those questions. You can kind of see the bigger implications. A lot of people think that a lot of the development is around on private lands. But you also have massive impacts, and these lands are your lands, right? These public lands are considered to be held in trust by all of the American citizens and people, and these are your lands, right? But certainly I'd say industry has had an imbalance of some of the use of those lands. You can go certainly to the Four Corners area in our own state and see some of that, where a lot of those public lands are no longer multiple use, they're singular use. And matter of fact, they're even fenced off for public safety concerns to be used for certain industries. And so why buy land when you can, lease it and potentially use the resources off it? And sometimes at that point, the big issue that we see across the country is, when you're done leasing it or done using it, you may also abandon it, right? And that's a big issue called abandoned oil and gas wells. And that's a major issue across the country, where folks and companies, either they dry up or they kind of reconfigure, and they may move on and leave those oil and gas wells just in place and not maintained and leaking and causing, everything from air issues to water issues or wildlife issues. And so that's kind of a bigger concern, obviously, that you'll see talked about in the public policy realms, and the amount of money that goes into kind of dealing with plugging and dealing and mitigating, abandoned oil and gas wells. But that's a big issue in our state. But it's huge issues in historic states like Pennsylvania, where some of these wells are on, people have their house and they're in their backyard, and there's an abandoned oil and gas well just leaking into the water in their backyard, right? I mean, it's just a major issue. You see it all over California, certainly all over some of the places in the Northeast, but it's a big issue here in New Mexico too. So let's talk about the Caja del Rio. Matt, do you want to see if you can cue up that video? This might be a great time for the show, and then I'll kind of walk folks real quick through that. I just want to be mindful of time for everyone. I super appreciate all the conversations we've had, and really grateful for that. Do I need to stop sharing, Matt, for you to do that?
No, I don't think so.
Okay. But yeah, really, really love the thoughtfulness of the questions. Really, I mean, it's amazing how that one chapter, right, evokes all that. And that's why it's so important, I think, to come back to. I'm guessing many folks in the room may not have read that chapter since Sunday school. But it's so much looming out there, and I believe has been kind of used to justify and even misused in lots of different ways. And so I think it's important for us to come back to that and have some of those critical conversations of, what are these words that say to rule responsibly, or to serve, or to keep the earth, right? Like, what does that mean for us? And to challenge other Christians in those interpretations, I think, is also very important. Something I know Matt likes to do for fun.
Oh, yeah.
So
You ready to watch this?
let's do it if you got it.
My name is Joseph Brophy Toledo. I come from the pueblo of
Need me
Jemez.
to stop sharing?
My connection to Caja is because of my ancestry with Pecos. The reason why they came to Caja was because of agricultural land. Everything around here is our pharmacy.
My name is Jose Lorenzo Villegas Sr. I am a landowner, property owner in the La Cienega land grant, the Caja del Rio area. The Caja has the resources of all. We have cattle, we have the wood, we have the water, we have the clean air.
My name is Reverend Andrew Black. I'm a minister at First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe. I'm a sportsman, and I'm a native of Santa Fe. The Caja del Rio is one of the most important cultural, archaeological, and sacred areas, not only in New Mexico, but really in the United States. What it technically means is the box of the rivers. It's a plateau that lies between the Rio Grande and the Santa Fe River. You've got all kinds of wildlife in here, ranging from elk and mule deer to bear, cougar, badger, golden eagles and bald eagles to burrowing owls. This area is the linchpin of wildlife connectivity. So when bigger climate disturbances and wildfires break out in the mountain ranges that surround the Caja del Rio, animals will relocate into this area.
Every time I come to the Caja, especially when I wear my moccasins, I feel the heartbeat. When we do our ceremonial ways, we pray for the land, especially Caja, for those protectors, because Earth people, that's our job.
The reason why I come up here specifically to pray to my Creator and to touch these sacred lands. When I come out here, I feel gentleness, I feel peace, I feel safe with the sacred lands that are here.
If you listen, you can actually hear the sound of sheer silence. And that's a sound that is not just heard with your ears, but is heard with your soul. The La Cienega petroglyph site has over 4,400 petroglyphs in less than a mile. It's one of the most densely populated petroglyph areas in the entire country.
Petroglyphs are so important because in those days, they wrote what happened. They are historical markers. It is a storybook that's written here, and the meaning behind everything that's there is part of me.
Some petroglyphs have been taken from here, actually taken from the rock cut and out of the sacred site. People dump all kinds of things over here, mattresses, washing machines. They even dump abandoned cars so they can do the shooting and use them as targets.
We're seeing that all the time. It is a daily threat.
We need permanent protections, not only for me, but for the younger ones that are coming back. My role is I teach the youth, like my daughter, when I bring her out here, I tell her, you're gonna be the future man. You're gonna be the one to interpret what I'm interpreting today.
The way I feel when I come out here with my dad is it's very powerful. It's important for younger generations because we need to know what happened in the years past and why our people use this land.
One of my favorite things to do on the Kaha is to bring my daughter hiking. She's 2 years old, and bringing her, I get to teach future generations about what it means to be a responsible steward of this landscape.
The city of Santa Fe has all these historical sites the tourists go visit. But what about this site over here that is sacred? My hopes for this beautiful sacred site, La Caja, is that we find a way to preserve and protect from it disappearing from us. This is not a dead history. It's a living museum.
All right, Andrew, we kind of need to wrap up. If you want to
Okay.
close us out.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you all got to see the film, correct? We couldn't see it on this end, Matt, but I assume that everyone in person saw it.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, perfect, good. That'll tee us up to kind of where we start the next time, which is talking about the Caja del Rio campaign, and then we're going to look at some of kind of the theology and spirituality of wildlife. But wanted to kind of tee that up for you because I think there's going to be a big talk of public lands. The Caja del Rio obviously was right, the ball's on the tip of the goal line to make it a national monument. And you probably have seen that in the papers or popping up. It's to say that we're beyond the 11th hour is probably an understatement. So whether that can ultimately happen with a swipe of a pen or not is tenuous at best right now, but you never know. So we will certainly kind of recap all that next week, and it's a great opportunity for us to kind of jump into the start of that, and then we'll get into a little bit of the theology and spirituality of wildlife as well. But I'm super grateful for you all. Thank you for taking time today. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions and really interesting perspectives on things. I really value that. So we look forward to talking more next time.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
You got it.
Have a good Sunday.
You too. Take care.